Okay, good. I got the wave, so we're good to start. How is everybody doing? Yeah, I can't believe another week has gone by. Can you believe it? Our numbers are quickly dropping, so I don't know if it's me or if it's you guys. So I don't actually have a joke to start with. Does anybody have a joke they can I'm sure Roger's got something. All right, you got something. Oh, that's a good one. No, I'm looking for something that's funny. Anybody got something? Roger, you got to have something up your sleeve.
Well, I had long sleeves on this morning, I did, but they fell out.
Good. Well, so the last 2 weeks we've covered basically, so from 605 to 516. So how many years is that? 605, 516. 80 years or something like that? Not quite 100 years. So I'd like to today try and cover 300. So we'll see. When I used to teach, my wife would always say, because I would kind of tell her, afterwards how I felt or whatever. She said, "You need to not tell your students what you're going to do because you usually don't do that." It's like, and it's probably true. You kind of run out of time or whatever. So I'll try and get going. But I'm really pumped about the material in this period of time. I just think it's really fascinating, and I hope you do too. Does anybody have a question maybe to start off with? Something that wasn't clear, something that you would like me to just briefly touch on or review? Anything like that? Yeah.
Well, I'm going to kind of throw in, not exactly a joke, but now that you
I knew you had something.
one of those back in the day when we were over in Haley.
Oh, okay.
And I was going to be preaching this Sunday, so I get up there anticipating humor. And I said, I'm going to buckle in and sit down because I'm going to start in Genesis and I'm going to finish in Revelations. And I'm anticipating this big ha 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 or whatever. Everybody's looking around. That's about the dumbest thing you can do. So a little bit like you're going to cover all that.
Right, that's probably right.
So there you go.
So, good. Any questions? David, you had a question?
This is older, but where did the name Hebrew come from?
So the word Hebrew actually comes, so in Hebrew it's ivrit, and it's related to the word beyond, ever. So like it really comes from the idea of it's like, where, like probably beyond like the Jordan River or on the other side of the Jordan River. You see it back in Genesis. Abraham is called the Hebrew. Usually the preferred name for the people of Israel is Israelites. Hebrew is usually, if you call somebody a Hebrew, it's usually from outsiders that are calling the Hebrews the Hebrews. Usually themselves, they refer to themselves as, the people of Israel or descendants of Jacob. They don't very commonly use the word Hebrew.
So I heard a guy say it was a derivative of Eber the Kenite, but
There's a connection to that. Yeah, I mean, I was telling you the etymology of the word, but in Genesis 10, for example, you have the genealogy of the peoples, and he's listed there, yeah. But the word itself actually means beyond something, right? Like on the other side of, basically.
I didn't know if he had some kind of a significance. Like I was thinking, if it's true, it's from Eber. Like, why did that dude get to be like the name that they used or whatever? But maybe that's not even what that connected.
Yeah, so to tie it into the class, the satrapy of where Israel is called beyond the Jordan. Ever hanahar, it's called in Hebrew. So it's the same word, ever ivri, right? It's the same word, actually, that's beyond the river. Good question. Let me pray for us, and then we'll start. Father, thank you for another week that has gone by, and thank you for health. All of us are here healthy, and we know that in this time that is not something that we take for granted. Lord, we think of those that maybe are sick. We pray that you would be with them and heal them. And we pray that you would help us now to be able to focus, enjoy our time, learn from your word, grow, and ultimately be tools for you so that we might be lights to the world. That's the ultimate goal. Thank you for showing yourself to us and enlightening us, our eyes to your word. And I pray that you would help us to always have a hunger for your word and to live it out. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so last week we basically ended here on this slide, if I'm correct. Is that right? Does this look familiar? So we talked about how Cyrus, the end of the Babylonian period, came with Cyrus, right? The decree that Cyrus makes in 539 BC. And he gives a decree not only to the Jews in Israel, it's actually to all the people that are under his hegemony, right? It's all of the different people groups. And remember I showed you the picture of the carrot versus the stick method. And so he chooses the carrot method. He says people can go back to their hometowns or their hometowns or their countries in order to resettle where they're at. And actually, if you look at Ezra, and we'll just pick it up right there. Ezra chapter 2, he doesn't just give them the boot, right, and kick them out of Persia. He actually sponsors the return back to the land. And we talked about there's how initially the living conditions for the Israelites in Babylon and then later Persia were a little bit not very favorable, or less favorable. And yet, as time went on, they became rich, and some of them started to prosper. And we looked at Ezra chapter 2, verse 6. All who went up were aided with vessels of silver, with gold, and goods, with beasts, and with costly wares, besides all that was freely offered. And then here it is in verse 7. I'm actually in Ezra 1. I think I said 2. Ezra 1, verse 7, King Cyrus also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and placed in the house of his gods. He brought these out and put them in charge of Mithredath, the treasurer, and counted them and gave them to the prince of Judah, Sheshbazzar. So I'm not going to go over all that again, but we talked about the timeline. They arrive in 639. They're excited. They're ready to go. They set the foundations to the altar in the springtime. They celebrate the Feast of Sukkot, or the Feast of Booths. It's September, October, which, by the way, that's next week. Today's Yom Kippur, right? Today's the Day of Atonement, actually, in the Jewish calendar. Next week is going to be Sukkot, so it's an 8-day festival. And we'll come back to that, hopefully, today, because it's related to what we'll talk about if I get there. And then they lay the foundations, and then the work stops for 19 years or so, 18 years. And that's where we ended, and then eventually it resumes under the leadership of Haggai and Zechariah. Remember, those are the two prophets there in Yehud, in the province of Judah there. And it takes them 5 years to finally complete the temple, and that brings us to the middle of the book of Ezra, which is where we are right now. Let me just read a verse here. Ezra chapter 6, verse 19. What's one of the first things that they do after building the temple? They celebrate the feast of Passover. Ezra chapter 6, verse 19. On the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover, and they rejoiced. Verse 22, they kept the feast of unleavened bread for 7 days, for the Lord had made them joyful. So that's where we left off last week. And there is one little issue that I want to talk about that I didn't get to. What happened to the ark? Right? Did it come back? Where is it? So I actually did some research, and we found where the ark is, and let me just show you a little clip here.
Where is the ark?
You have to listen.
I thought we'd settled that. The ark is somewhere very safe. From whom? The ark is a source of unspeakable power, and it has to be researched.
And it will be, I assure you, Dr. Brody, Dr. Jones. We have top men working on it right now.
Who?
Top men.
The drama kills you, right? So we know where the ark is. It's in D.C. Is that where he's at right there? Or New York, or wherever he is? When I teach a whole class on this, I like to go into it a little bit more depth and actually take an hour to talk about it. But I'm going to do it in like a minute. There's like 10 different views, actually. And if you look at different historical books, extra biblical texts, different traditions, everybody has an idea. Even Indiana Jones has an idea of where the ark is. My personal opinion is there's no point in looking anywhere because I think it was destroyed. I think it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, and I don't think it's just a guess. There's a couple verses that I can turn to that suggest that. Let me read Jeremiah chapter 3. Okay, Jeremiah 3, to me this is the strongest verse that gives us an indication of what happened to the ark during the Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah 3, verse 16. This is Jeremiah speaking, and he says, when you have multiplied and increased in the land, and he's talking about in Babylon, in those days, declares the Lord, they shall no more say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. And then here it is, it says, it shall not be made again. At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord, and all the nations shall gather to it, to the presence of the Lord in Jerusalem, and they shall no more stubbornly follow their own evil hearts. So Jeremiah says that when you're in Babylon, there's going to come a time where you're no longer going to say, you're no longer going to remember the ark or miss it, and it won't be made again. So to me, that's an indication that it was destroyed. And if you look at Lamentations, chapter 2, verse 1, again, remember Jeremiah is talking about the exile, and he's writing a dirge over what had happened. And he says, how the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. The word footstool there is sometimes used to indicate the throne of God. And the throne of God is the ark, right? Remember, God was on top of the ark where the cherubim, those golden cherubim were. And so here, another kind of indication, it says he has not remembered it, the implication possibly being that it was destroyed. To me, those are the two best verses that I can point to that seem to indicate that it was destroyed. What we can say, though, is that the ark didn't come back. Right? If you go back to Ezra chapter 2, you actually have, I keep saying 2, Ezra chapter 1, you have the vessels that are mentioned, the silver and the plates and the goblets and all the different vessels that go into the house of the Lord. The ark's not mentioned there. So it doesn't come back. And actually, throughout the Second Temple period, there never was an ark in the Holy of Holies. Maybe at some point I'll come back to that. But throughout the entire Second Temple period, the Holy of Holies sat empty without an ark. So I think it's gone. Some people say maybe it's under the Temple Mount. To me, it seems like Jeremiah is indicating that it was destroyed, and it makes sense if you think about it. If you are a Babylonian emperor who thinks you are God, right, and you think you're more powerful than this kingdom of Judah that's a small kind of backwater nation, you destroy their city, you destroy their temple. Makes sense you destroy their relic, their icon, their symbol of who God is, right? Because that's like you saying, I'm stronger than this person. My God is stronger than your God. Look what happened to your God. He's ground up into dust. That seems like it makes sense to me. But again, we can't be sure. Maybe it is in Washington, D.C. I don't know. But I think it's probably gone. So the Jews return in 539. That's the first wave. And I'll just briefly mention this guy here. This is the next king after Cyrus, Cambyses. And the only really thing that's mentioned about him, he's not even mentioned in the Bible, actually, but look at Ezra chapter 4. Ezra chapter 4, verse 5. And I'm going to come back to this passage again later on. But the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. Remember, we ended with that. They stopped building the temple because they're afraid of getting attacked. And they bribed the counselors against them to frustrate their purpose. All the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, who we just talked about, who let them come back initially, even into the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So the only thing the Bible alludes to in regard to this guy is that, it doesn't even mention him, the work ceased throughout his entire reign. Okay, so that's all I have to say about him. The Jews do nothing while he is the emperor there in Persia, and the work resumes under Darius the First. Now this guy, just a couple things about him. The temple is completed under his rule. It takes them about 5 years to complete the temple. I know my number sometimes a little different, 516, 515. Whenever you're doing chronology, you're off about a year, so don't be too specific with the year there. But it takes about 5 years for the temple to be completed. And that's under Darius the First's rule. Now, there's a lot of names that sound the same. Darius the Mede, Cyrus, Nabonidus, right? All of those names, don't get him mixed up. He's not Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king. He's not Cyrus, the first Persian king, and he's not Darius the Mede, who's mentioned in Daniel chapter 5. It's another guy, okay? So this is Darius the Great. So he's a Persian king, and they actually have an inscription that talks about, that he sponsored, that talks about his rise to the throne. It's called the Behistun inscription. And this is in Persia, okay? It's in Iran of today. You get to still up there on a cliff. Pretty cool. You go there and you see, there's Darius right there with his servants that are coming before him. And the inscription's written in 3 different languages. One of them is in cuneiform, and that's how we helped to decipher Akkadian. It was actually from this inscription, because one of them was, I think, in Greek. And so we were able to kind of match it, and that's how basically they deciphered Akkadian. So here's a couple pictures of this Behistun inscription up there on the side of this wall, on the side of this cliff. Now, during his rule, the 2 prophets that are active is Haggai and Zechariah, as I mentioned earlier. And he also inherits a kingdom that is fraught with wars with Persia. And this begins a 150-year rivalry between Persia and Greece. And it's going to come to an end with the guy that's the strongest, right? And that's Alexander the Great. Okay, so there's this 150-year rivalry between these 2 big powers that are sort of vying for control of the Middle East, and we call those the Persian Wars. Okay, moving on. After Darius, we come to a king called Xerxes or Ahasuerus in the book of Esther. Okay, so this is the period of Esther. Now, again, during Esther's time, we don't have very much information about what's going on in Israel. So we're kind of bouncing back and forth between Persia and Israel. Kind of what is life like for these people? Well, during Esther's time, life could be good, right? An example of that is, well, you could be queen, right? I mean, Esther actually becomes queen in the Persian period, in the Persian Empire. But life could also be kind of miserable. And this is one of a number of instances where various people groups try to do away with the nation of Israel. Okay, so this is Haman. Let me just read Ezra chapter 3. Ezra chapter 3, verse 8. Now, in the second year after Esther, sorry. Esther chapter 3. Ezra chapter 3, verse 8. Remember, Haman comes up with a plan. And Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So life could be good. You could become queen, technically. Usually a position that's open for one person. But they were still prosperous. That's not why that's why not everybody left Persia. But also they could be blamed for, some of the injustices or some of the bad things that happened in the Persian Empire. Now, it's during Esther's time, actually, if we go back to Ezra chapter 4, that in the land of Israel now, okay, so Ezra's in Persia, now back to the land of Israel, the Jews are accused of doing something. We're not told what, but they're accused of something. Ezra chapter 4, verse 6. In the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they, that's the people of the land of Israel, wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Time out for just a second, okay? If you're ever reading through Ezra and you get to chapter 4, you might be a little confused. Okay, this is a side note for a second. Okay, if you look at Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 talk about the period in Cyrus's reign. Okay, Cyrus, the guy that let the Jews go back to Israel. And then at the end of verse 4, look at what it says, that they stopped the building of the temple all the days of Cyrus and even into the reign of Darius, king of Persia. That's this guy here, right? That guy. So from Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius. But then notice what the author says. He continues, he says, and in the reign of Ahasuerus, a.k.a. Xerxes, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of the land. Okay, so that's in his reign. And then look at the next verse, verse 7. In the days of Artaxerxes, Bishlam and these other guys, they wrote an accusation to the king and said, hey, look at what the Jews are doing. And then now go to the very end of chapter 4, verse 24. The work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. See what he's doing? He's going back. After him is Artaxerxes, and then he says he goes back to Darius. So what's the chronology in this chapter? The point is that what the author is doing is he's talking about the return to Israel and how they're building the temple, and then he says, oh yeah, they discouraged the people of the land from building the temple. And then he goes on a rabbit trail. Then he's like, oh, and that was kind of like another thing that happened in the reign of Ahasuerus, and that was like another thing that happened in the reign of Artaxerxes, and that was like another thing, and then he goes back to Darius, and then he picks up the story again, and he completes the story of the building of the temple. Does that make sense? So what I'm talking about now is in verse, we're talking about Xerxes here. So the Jews are accused of something. We're not told what, but it is interesting that it's right about the time that Egypt revolts against the Persian Empire. Okay, if you look at the extra biblical history, Egypt revolts, and coinciding with that is this note here in Ezra chapter 4. So it could be that the people of the land, the people of the satrapy of beyond the river, are suspicious of anybody that is sort of doing some unusual activity, right? Because they perhaps are, starting to form, they're starting to build the temple, they're doing some, well, this is after the temple, but they're kind of coming together, and so any kind of movement or any kind of, awakening of a people group could upset the balance of power in the region. Maybe they're with the Egyptians who are revolting against the Persians. And so they write a letter back to the emperor, Ahasuerus, and he says, hey, get these people to submit to you. It looks like they're bad news. And that's going to happen again a little bit later, but let me finish here. What's interesting about that is if you look at Esther chapter 1, okay, you remember the story. Esther, first of all, Ahasuerus is unhappy with his wife, Vashti. Remember that? And Esther, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job. You find Esther here. And in verse 1, or verse 3 of Esther 1, we read that it was in the 3rd year of his reign that he gave a feast for all of his officials. Okay, so that's where the story begins. It's the 3rd year of his reign, and Vashti comes along, or he tells Vashti to come. She doesn't come. He's unhappy with her, and he wants to find another wife. Remember that? That's the 3rd year of his reign. But then if you look at when Esther is actually chosen, how long does it take him to choose a wife? It actually takes him 4 years, right? If you look at verse 16 of Esther chapter 3, Esther chapter 2, it's in the 7th year of his reign that the king, verse 17, loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins in the palace. So why does it take him 4 years, from year 3 to year 7, to choose Esther? When you read along, it seems like it goes right away. I think it's because of what's happening in the background. Persia is dealing with a bunch of revolts down in Egypt. There's a revolt down in Babylon. There's this sort of great Persian war where Athens sort of starts to rise, and there's some trouble in his kingdom. And actually, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, is not successful against the Athenians, and he actually sort of retreats with his tail between his legs. He's not defeated yet, but he does retreat. And really, things kind of settle down at that point, and so really, he's not freed up from fighting until about the 7th year of his reign. And I think that fits with what you read in the book of Esther, that he chooses the queen only in the 7th year of his reign. So I think there's an interesting little insight there into the background. As I mentioned, he inherits a revolting empire. Now, the historical context of Ahasuerus going from one woman to another, rejecting one wife in favor of another, finds an interesting, not parallel, but an interesting backdrop in the story that is told about Ahasuerus in a history that is told by a Greek historian called Herodotus. Am I talking too fast? There's a Greek historian called Herodotus that talks about the life of Ahasuerus, and he says this. Now, this looks real confusing, but let me explain it. He tells a story about how Xerxes, a.k.a. Ahasuerus, it's the same guy, he's married to this girl here, Amystress, I'm not sure how you're supposed to say it, but he falls in love with his brother's wife, actually. And so what he does, now I can't tell you the logic of this, but what he does is he thinks, oh, maybe I'll have the chance of having my brother's wife if I marry my son to my brother's daughter. So if I marry then somehow maybe I'll be able to have my brother's wife. But what happens incidentally is in doing that, he himself falls in love with his brother's daughter, and trouble ensues, as you can imagine, right? He ends up getting killed. But that's an interesting story when you think about what is told about Ahasuerus in the Bible. Kind of a similar thing, not different circumstances, but a similar idea of leaving one woman for another. So you could see how that could happen given what we know about Herodotus, or about Xerxes in the writings of Herodotus. Now, all of this happens before Ezra and Nehemiah return with the 2nd wave and 3rd wave of returnees. Okay, we haven't even met Ezra yet, and we're halfway through his book. You have the rebuilding of the temple. You have the Jews accused of rebelling in about 485, which is about the time that Egypt is rebelling in the Persian Empire. And you have the whole story of Esther happening in Persia. The next 2 waves are going to arrive under the rule of Artaxerxes. And it looks like I misspelled it. It should be with an A there. Okay, and this brings us to Ezra chapter 7, verse 1. So I want to read a couple verses here. Ezra chapter 7, verse 1. Actually, just before we get to that, let me mention this, that there are more revolts in Egypt and more wars with the Greeks. And the reason that's important is that Well, let me come back to that a little bit later on. Okay, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So what's happening in the land of Israel? Ezra arrives from Persia. Now what's his background? If you look at chapter 7, verse 1, he is a Levite. Okay, let me just read. After this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, the son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, and then these other names. Verse 6, or he's the end of verse 5, he's the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the chief priest. Okay, so he's from the tribe of Levi, and he's a priest, which means he's a descendant of Aaron, and he went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given, and the king granted him all that he had asked, for the hand of the Lord his God on him. So he's a scribe. Now, what do scribes do? Right. Correct, right? That's right. But now what's interesting is that scribes actually kind of right around this period of time, scribes are not only just manually writing out the scriptures, they're also instructing. They're also teaching. When you get to the time of the New Testament, you remember how Jesus frequently says, the scribes and the Pharisees say, right? And so a scribe was actually a teacher. He writes the law, but he's also teaching the law. And this is what Ezra's mission was, actually. His mission was not just to write the law. That's what he did, I guess, as a profession in Babylon, in Persia, I should say. But he was sent to Israel in order to teach the law, in order to actually instruct the people. And we see that in verse 10. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of Moses, to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. And so what he was supposed to do, if you continue on in chapter 7, Artaxerxes sends him to the land, and he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to teach the people of Israel, the Jews that are living in Israel, the law of God, because that's going to be actually the civic code. That's going to be the rule by which the peoples are going to abide by. And that goes back to Persian policy. Okay, when Cyrus gave the decree, he sent all of his people back and he says, you can study your own religion and you actually are going to abide by sort of your own religious rules, so long as you pay taxes to Persia. But different people are going to have sort of different ways of life. And so that's what Ezra was sent to do. Verse 25, you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God that is in your hand, appoint magistrates and judges who may judge all the people in the province beyond the river, all such as know the laws of God, of your God. So it's not just the Jews that are living in Yehud, right, in that little province of Judah, because they had scattered to other places. Primarily they're living in Yehud, but there's pockets of Jews elsewhere. And so Ezra's task was to teach all Jews the law of God, and those who do not know them, you shall teach. Okay, so the point here is Ezra is sent to teach the law and establish the Torah as sort of the civil law, right? Establish the law of God as the civil law for the people of Israel. Now, I like to think of Ezra as Erasmus. And I'll describe this in just a second. Notice, this is what Erasmus says. Erasmus was a Greek scholar. We kind of know him from being the first guy to compile the Greek New Testament into sort of a book and kind of try to standardize it. So he's a scholar, but also, interestingly, he wanted people to know the Bible in their own language. And he says this, I totally disagree with those who are unwilling that the Holy Scriptures, translated into the common tongue, should be read by the unlearned. Christ desires his mysteries to be published abroad as widely as possible. I could wish that even women, now to say that back then was a pretty bold statement, even women could read the gospel and St. Paul's epistles, and I would that they were translated into all the languages of all Christian people. that they might be read and known not merely by the Scots and the Irish, but even the Turks and the Saracens, or the Arabs and the Muslims. And then he says this, I wish that the farm worker might sing parts of them at the plow, that the weaver might hum them at the shuttle, and that the traveler might beguile the weariness of the way by reciting them. Really cool. I wish we talked like that nowadays, right? So basically he's saying everybody should be able to read the Bible in their own language. Now, why am I emphasizing that? Remember, the Jews go off to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, and what language was the international language of the time? Aramaic. That's the lingua franca. As time went on, they're separated from the land of Israel, so the Jews started to pick up Aramaic, so much so that some of them actually forgot Hebrew, and Aramaic became their mother tongue. And so when they come back to the land of Israel, not everybody, but some people no longer knew the language of the Bible. And so Ezra, in Nehemiah chapter 8, Ezra is there. He's reading the law at the water gate there in Nehemiah. So it's, he's with Nehemiah at this time, but it's Ezra. Ezra and the Levites helped the people to understand the law while the people remained in their places. And they read from the book of the law, the book of the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. And the idea here is not only that they exposited the Bible, but they also explained it in a language that they could understand. Because a lot of the people coming back are speaking Aramaic. And so they said it in a way so that they could understand the readings. Give you another little side trail here. As time went on, what the Jews would do is they would actually expound on the Hebrew scriptures in Aramaic. And these sort of homilies or kind of interpretations and explanations of the Bible eventually got written down, and it became known as targums. I don't know if you ever heard of that word before. But these are Aramaic explanations of the Hebrew Bible because people that are reading the Hebrew Bible didn't always understand the language. Okay, so I could say more about that, but I'll stop there. So Ezra is this kind of Erasmus figure. He comes to not only teach the law, but to make it understandable to the people who by now are speaking Aramaic. One of the main problems when Ezra arrives to the land is the issue of mixed marriages. Okay, so the people had married. Well, let me read it. Ezra chapter 9. The people had married Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, Amorites, and they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves. So Ezra arrives and he says, hey, this has got to stop. These people are leading you away from the Lord. And so he deals with that problem. And that's this second wave, okay, the second wave of Jews that come back with Ezra. And it's a problem that the third wave is going to have to deal with as well, under the leadership of Nehemiah, okay, who's coming up here next. Now, Ezra comes to the land of Israel in about 458, okay, BC. So we're cruising through another 8 years or so go by. And the governor of beyond the river revolts again. Okay, so there's more kind of revolts in the empire. Now, why is this important? This is important because it's on the heels of this revolt against the Persian king Artaxerxes that a letter is written to Artaxerxes in Persia by the Jews' adversaries. Okay, go back to Ezra chapter 4. Remember that chapter that I talked about earlier? Ezra chapter 4, in the days of Artaxerxes. Okay, so this is the time of Ezra, 450 or so BC. The rest, Bishlam and Mithridath, these people of the land, wrote a letter to the king of Persia in Aramaic, and this is what it says. He says, verse 11, Ezra chapter 4:11, to Artaxerxes the king, your servants, the men of the province beyond the river, send you greetings. Good way to start a letter to an emperor. Greetings. And now be it known to the king that the Jews who came up from you to us have gone to Jerusalem. They are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. Now be it known to the king that if this city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be impaired. Now, because we eat the salt of the palace, and it's not fitting for us to witness the king's dishonor, we send and inform the king that a search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers. And you will find in the book of the records and learn that this city is a rebellious city, hurtful to kings and provinces, and that sedition was stirred up in it from of old. And that's why the city was laid to waste. So, why did I read that? Well, historically, the governor of beyond the river revolts in 450, okay, against the king of Persia. And now, on the heels of that, the Jews are starting to kind of rebuild the walls, actually, even before Nehemiah comes. And so they're again suspicious of any kind of activity that is going on in the region, because maybe they're against the king of Persia. And so they write a letter to Artaxerxes, and how does Artaxerxes respond? Put an end to it, he says. Verse 21, therefore make a decree that these men be made to cease, and that this city be not rebuilt until a decree is made by me. So the work is stopped, okay, by Artaxerxes. Here's just that province, or the satrapy again of beyond the river. Now, that letter is written in 458, 3 years before Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem. Okay? So, give you the history again one more time. There's sort of this revolt in beyond the river. By the time they write a letter back to Artaxerxes about the Jews, that's 3 years later. And then we come to Nehemiah. Okay, now I think that gives a little bit of background into the beginning of the book of Nehemiah, because how does the book start? Okay, look at Nehemiah chapter 1. Nehemiah is in Susa, the capital, and he hears from people that had come back from Israel. He says that there is a remnant in the province who have survived the exile, and they're in great trouble. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. Now, I think I'm in the minority probably here, but the question is, what destruction of the walls are they talking about? Are they talking about Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the city's walls back in 586, or are they talking about this in 447, right, when Artaxerxes had told the Jews to stop rebuilding the walls? To me, it makes more sense that they're talking about this, right, about what had just happened 3 years earlier. And to me, that's why when Nehemiah is informed of that, and he wants to talk to the king and say, hey, I want to go back and help rebuild the walls, what does the Bible say that his response is? He's terrified, right? If you look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 2, he goes into the king, and the king says to him, why is your face sad, seeing that you are not sick? There is nothing but sadness of heart. And then Nehemiah says this, he says, then I was very much afraid. Now, why would he be very much afraid? He's a Jewish person. He's from Israel. I think he's very much afraid because Artaxerxes 3 years earlier had just said, nobody's going to rebuild the walls until I give a decree otherwise. And yet here he's going to come in and say, hey, let me, your cupbearer, go back and lead a team of people to rebuild the walls. And by the way, the cupbearer is a pretty important position in the kingdom. He's got to be the closest guy to the king, right? Because if you're going to be sipping the wine of the king, you want to make sure that you can trust the guy and that he's not just spitting it out when you're not looking and it's poisoned or something like that. Okay, so I think that's the backdrop to Nehemiah. Artaxerxes has just issued a report to the Jews not to continue building because he's suspicious of any activity that's going on in beyond the river, because the governor just years before that had revolted against him. So Nehemiah, eventually, you know the story. He goes in, he prays to God. They fast, actually. And Artaxerxes gives him the permission to go back and lead a group of people back to Israel to rebuild the walls. So here's Susa. He makes this long journey back over to Israel. And he arrives at night. And you kind of remember the story. I like how the author kind of like sets it up. He does this like clandestine like investigation of the walls. He goes around, looks at night. Let's just read a couple verses. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 12. Jeremiah speaking, he says, I rose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. And I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. And then I went to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. And so I went up by night in the valley gate, inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so I returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were doing the work. Now, I love Nehemiah because he is such a great example of what a leader is supposed to be. Right? A leader, in fact, I was just talking to my son about this the other day. My son was saying, is a woman supposed to be like submissive to her husband? And I was like, well, yes, the Bible says that in Ephesians 5, but a good leader is somebody that's not like ruling with a rod of iron, right? A good leader is somebody that's like John Elway, right? You guys know who John Elway was? He's the Broncos were always down by like 5 with like 30 seconds on the clock, and they got 40 yards to go to make it to the end zone. And John Elway comes in, he says, here's the plan. Here's what we're going to do. We're down by 5. We only got 40 seconds. It's the third down, but we can make it. You're going to run to that side. If you're covered, I'm going to look to you, and I'm going to pass you the ball. You're going to catch it. You're going to jump over the finish line right as the clock strikes 0, and the crowd's going to cheer, and we're going to win. Like, who wouldn't want to follow that kind of a person, right? He's got a plan. He's like, we're down, but I got a plan for how we can win. That's what a good leader is supposed to be. And I think Nehemiah is like this person, right? He comes in, he's like, investigates, and he comes up with a plan and says, here's what we're going to do. Okay, the enemies around you, the people around you, the Samaritans, the Ammonites, all those guys, they're discouraging you, but you're going to put a sword on your side, you're going to hold a trowel on the other hand, and you're going to build those walls. And he succeeds in getting the people motivated to rebuild the walls in 52 days. And that's the kind of a person that somebody wants to follow. If that's how you lead, and I'm talking to myself here, if that's how I lead my family, then people are going to want to follow me. If I'm just going to come in and say, I don't know, we got problems, we should do something. I've just noticed in my own marriage that if I don't have a good plan and just kind of wishy-washy, that's usually when problems arise. So I like Nehemiah. I think he's a great example of somebody who's a good leader. And as you know the story, the walls are completed in 52 days after a lot of different troubles that you read through in Nehemiah. Here's a couple pictures of Susa. They've actually excavated the place. Here's sort of the throne room where Artaxerxes would have been. And so his mission is slightly different than Ezra's. Well, very different than Ezra's. What's Ezra's mission? To teach the people the law. Okay, that's the wave number 2 that returns. That's 458 BC. And then 444 is when Nehemiah comes to the area, and his mission is to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that the people of Israel can be secured in their town there. Now, the main religious problem there is, again, the problem of mixed marriages. Okay, so Ezra had dealt with that earlier, about 13 years earlier or so, or how many years is that? 14 years earlier. And now that problem had cropped up once again. They deal with the mixed marriages, and Nehemiah ends up staying in Jerusalem for 12 years. He's actually given the title, he's the official governor of Yehud. Okay, he stays there for 12 years, and That's the end of the Old Testament. If you get to the end of Nehemiah, it's pretty underwhelming. Like you read the end of Nehemiah, and he just says, "Remember me, O God, for good." And they're like, "Is that the end? Like, did everybody come back? Did the people like serve God? What happened?" That's the end of the history of the Old Testament. There's a few other, prophetic references, like in the book of Daniel, which we'll talk about. But Daniel is living during sort of a change between Babylon and Persia, and he's looking forward into the Greek period and even touching on Rome. But he doesn't give us any history of what's going on at the time. That's the end of the Old Testament. Okay, it comes to an end in 433, and I like how this person sort of talks about the end of the Old Testament. He says this. He says, Nehemiah's activities in Jerusalem bring the historical record of ancient Israel to a close. Although some of the predictions concerning Israel's future are given in some of the prophetic books, like Daniel, the inspired history of God's people comes to an abrupt end in Nehemiah 13:31. From a modern perspective, this is a rather surprising conclusion to the history of ancient Israel. But perhaps there's a profound theological implication to this non-ending of the Old Testament. Israel's history does not come to a proper closure because this is not the end. God is not finished with his chosen nation. Although no inspired prophetic voice will be heard over the next 4 centuries, this is only Act 1 of God's drama of redemption. In due time, Act 2 will open with the voice of one crying in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." So I like how that person says that. It's sort of a non-ending, but it begs the question, so what next? And I think that really leads the way to the New Testament. But first we'll go through some other non-inspired history to get to the New Testament, right, to see what happens between now and then. Now, we know from other sources that, there's other Persian kings. There's just a lot of sort of turmoil in the Persian Empire. The satrap of one of these satrapies is assassinated. The temple there in Elephantine Island is destroyed. Remember we talked about that in Egypt, around 399, 400 or so. And then there's more revolts. Some place the writing of Chronicles at this time. Okay, the book of Chronicles. Now Chronicles ends, if you look at verse 36, just with the return in 539. So it doesn't go into the history, but some say that it was written at that time. And then there's more kings, more revolts. They lose Egypt. The Persian flame is nearly extinguished, and it all comes to an end for Persia with Darius III, who is defeated by Alexander in about 330 BC. And that brings us to a quick summary. So, summarizing the Persian Empire. Persian Empire begins with Cyrus, in 539. The Persians become more powerful and rule for longer than Babylon. Babylon rules for how long? 70 years. Persia rules for, well, you can do the math, 539 to about 330. How many years is that? I don't know. I can't do the math in my own. Where's my phone? A little over 200. So almost triple the amount of time of Babylon. 3 waves of returnees. Just as there were 3 waves of exiles, and again, that's under Sheshbazzar when they rebuild the temple, under Ezra when he teaches the law to the people, and under Nehemiah when they rebuild the walls in 444. And that is the end of the Old Testament period. And with that, let's take a quick break. I know some of you guys are nodding off. Let's take a 5-minute break. Stretch your legs, and then we'll just start back up with Greece. Sound okay? Okay, good. So now we move into the Greek period, and I think you'll notice right away that we're in a totally different world. And that's what's kind of cool about going kind of systematically through this, is you see how drastic the change is between what I like to think of as the old world and the new world, right? The world of the East, the Middle East, and the world of the West. And it all starts with really this guy, Alexander the Great, but his father actually is Philip. Okay, so he's from Macedon. Okay, so he's a Macedonian guy. He's from the west. Okay, so Macedonia is here. This is Asia Minor area of Turkey. This is Lebanon. This is Israel down here, Cyprus. Okay, so he's from Macedonia. And his father, Philip, is actually the leader of sort of this conglomeration of Greek cities that had united in order to fight against the Persians. Remember, there's this 150-year rivalry between the Persians and the Greeks. And so Philip of Macedon goes out, fights against them year-round, but he dies very quickly, actually. And so his son takes over, and his son is Alexander the Great, okay? And the goal of the Greeks was to avenge Greece, or to punish the Persians by attacking them, okay? So avenge Greece by attacking the Persians. That's their sort of main goal in their fighting here. And he was actually educated under a philosopher that we've heard of, Aristotle. And there's that, famous joke of where the teacher stands up to his kids that are in college and he says, "How old are you guys?" They're like, 20, 21. They're like, "What have you done with your life so far?" 20 years old? And they're like, "I worked at McDonald's." "Okay. What have you done with your life?" "I played the trumpet." Like, "Man, you guys haven't done anything in your life." When Alexander was 20 years old, he conquered the whole world. And one student raises his hand. He said, "Yeah, but look at who his teacher was." And the teacher's like, "Oh, yeah, I should probably be a better teacher." So he's educated under Aristotle, given really kind of a world-class education, and he becomes the king of Macedon at 20 years old. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And he jumps into the task full with 2 feet, right, with full throttle. And he starts off by crossing the I forget what that's called, actually. It was just, the Bosphorus, thank you, the Bosphorus Strait into Asia Minor. And I like what this Greek writer says, I think it's Diodorus. He says, Alexander personally sailed with 60 fighting ships to the Troad, where he flung his spear from the ship and fixed it in the ground, and then leapt ashore himself, the first of the Macedonians, signifying that he received Asia from the gods as a spear-won prize. So he gets out there, and he's at the head of the army. He's not leading from behind. And what's surprising is how successful he is in so short of a period of time. He takes Sardis, these other cities, Miletus, and then goes down through kind of the area of kind of southern Turkey, and then heads up to Gordian. And there's this famous ancient oracle, right, that foretold that if anybody could unloosen this unpenetrable knot at Gordian, then that person would become ruler of the world. And according to the legend, Alexander unsheaths his sword and slashes the Gordian knot. And he says, "I'm going to be the ruler of the world." And he actually does, right? And he actually becomes the ruler of the world. He then goes down to Tarsus, which eventually is a very key city. There's the Cilician gates here, and it's a very key city just as you're heading to the east towards Mesopotamia. But he does all of this in 1 year. I mean, when you think about they're moving tens of thousands of people on horseback, and he does all of that in a period of 1 year, and basically is unstoppable. But along comes Persia. Okay, so Persia's not ready to give up the fight just yet. And so there's this battle at Issus, or Isis, kind of funny. And that's in 333. Okay, 333 BC. Darius III, he's the last really Persian emperor of the Persian Empire. And he meets up with Alexander the Great. And so you got the Greeks fighting against the Persians, and Alexander defeats Darius with 40,000 men. Darius escapes barely with his life, leaving his wife and family behind, heavily outnumbered, his tail's between his legs, and that's basically the end of Persia. I mean, there's a couple other fights, but basically that's where Persia comes to an end, and Alexander becomes sort of this, well, not just then, but a year earlier, becomes this well-known Greek conqueror that is unstoppable. Now, instead of finishing the job right away, though, instead of continuing down to Persia and taking, their capital, Susa and Ecbatana and those other cities there in Persia, Alexander first has a smart military strategy. He goes down and he decides to fight against Egypt. And the reason there is he wants to sort of put a stop to this other cat that could join forces with this cat, right? And with joining their forces, they could push back the Greeks. So he wants to keep them at bay. So he actually comes down through the land of Israel into Egypt and fights against the people there in Egypt. Now, on the way down, he is basically unhindered in his fight on his way towards Egypt. Cities all along that western flank there of the shore of the Mediterranean there, they fall without a fight, with one exception, the city of Tyre. So the city of Tyre there, you can zoom in on Google Earth a little bit better, but it's actually an island. Actually, I think it should be there. The arrow should be up here. At one point it was an island, now it's actually joined together as an isthmus. But the Tyrians had aligned themselves with Darius III, and the Persian army had given them grain and supplies, and they had helped them out in different fights. So they fought against Alexander, and a 7-month siege actually ensues. And Alexander the Great finally takes Tyre after 7 months, and he wants to make these Tyrians an example. And so he takes 30,000 survivors in Tyre, sells them off into slave markets, and then he crucifies 2,000 Tyrians publicly. He says, this is what happens to you if you fight against Greece. And basically, it's a pretty successful tactic. He takes almost all of the land of Israel with no fight. He goes down to Gaza, but then there's he makes an interesting little move, and he heads up to Jerusalem. And there's a story that is told about an encounter between Alexander the Great and the high priest in Jerusalem. And that's told in the book of Josephus, in Josephus' book, the Antiquities. And I thought it might be interesting, just let me read a couple lines here from the Antiquities of the Jews. This is what Josephus says happens. He says, when Alexander, after taking Gaza, down there, he was in haste to go up to the city of Jerusalem. And when the high priest heard this, he was in agony of fear, not knowing how he could meet up with the Macedonians, whose king was angered by his former disobedience. He therefore ordered the people to make supplications. So the high priest tells his people, offer sacrifices to God, pray, so that Alexander won't, attack us and not like us. But when he had gone to sleep after the sacrifice, God spoke to him in his sleep. This is Josephus saying, right? And he says, basically, don't be afraid. Everything's going to be okay. And so then he continues on, and then Alexander the Great comes up to Jerusalem. The high priest goes out to him, and he says, come on over into the temple and offer sacrifices at the temple, at our temple. And so Alexander the Great went up to the temple where he sacrificed to God under the direction of the high priest and showed him due honor to the priests and to the high priest himself. So Josephus says Alexander the Great showed due honor to the high priest. And then he says this. He says, when the book of Daniel was shown to Alexander the Great, in which he had declared that one of the Greeks would destroy the empire of the Persians, he believed himself to be the one indicated, and in his joy, he dismissed the multitude for the time being. And then eventually, he ends up being nice to the Jews. So an interesting little story. Some historians kind of question whether or not Josephus is telling the truth. But what I wanted to point out, though, is that Alexander the Great is actually talked about in the Bible. Okay, so in Daniel chapter 8, let me read a couple verses for you here. Alexander is described as a goat, okay, with a long horn. Let me read Daniel 8, 1 through 8. So this is in the 3rd year of the king of Belshazzar. A vision appeared to Daniel after that which appeared to me at first. And I saw the vision, verse 3. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one of them was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. And I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue him from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. And then as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with his powerful wrath, and I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and he struck the ram with his 2 horns, and the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. And then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. An interesting little allegory, I guess, there that is told about a ram with 2 horns and a goat. And now I think you can probably put the pieces together a little bit more clearly. The ram with the 2 horns is signifying the Medes and the Persians. One of them has a taller horn because the Medes initially are stronger, then eventually the Persians take over. Remember, Cyrus unites the 2 into one kingdom, and the kingdom expands across the whole earth. How does it come to an end? With the goat, right? The goat comes along and he knocks the ram off of its feet, does away with him. That's Darius III. The Persians are now wiped off of the map of history, and the goat becomes exceedingly great. But when it was exceedingly great, the great horn, it's got 1 horn, like a unicorn, I guess, and it was broken off, and instead of the 1 came up 4 horns, right? And that is symbolizing what happens to Alexander the Great's kingdom after he dies. Okay, he leaves no viable heir. And so his kingdom is divided up among his 4 generals. And I'll come back to this in just a second. Okay, so Josephus says that the high priest reads this story to Alexander the Great. You can decide whether or not you trust Josephus, but he is talked about here in the book of Daniel, foretold several hundred years before that even happened. So it's a fascinating story, fascinating book. That's when Alexander the Great pops into Josephus, into Jerusalem. He does pop into Josephus. But then after that, he eventually goes down to Egypt, takes Egypt almost without a fight, declares himself to be Pharaoh, actually, and everything is taken except for the very last vestiges of Persia here in 332, and that's when Alexander then moves to Mesopotamia and beyond. Now, he goes to Persia, does away with Darius III, who now he finally does kill, and then look at where he goes. Right? I'm not going to talk about all these little cities, but he eventually goes all the way over to India, up into the mountains up here, and then eventually comes back, and like his father, he also has an untimely death. Okay, this is now 323 BC, and he gets a fever and dies in Babylon. And at this point, he's 33 years old. So by the time he's 20, so he becomes king at 20 and dies at 33, 13 years, he conquers all of the known world, pretty much. So pretty incredible guy. Here's another map of his empire. His successes are what are incredible, right? Here's kind of another map here. You can see all the way on the other side there of the globe. Now, Alexander the Great ushered in the Hellenistic age, and with him come huge changes worldwide. Okay, he ushers in what is known as Hellenism. And what is Hellenism? I think before I get to that, let me just pause for a second and just kind of give you an idea of how different this world is. Right? So remember, Alexander is the student of Aristotle, but Aristotle's teacher was Plato, and Plato's teacher was Socrates. So Socrates is kind of one of the fathers of philosophy, and Plato talks about him when he writes about him in the Republic, but he says that he was an ugly guy. Now, it's interesting, actually, because Socrates used that sort of to advance his own philosophy. And one of the things that he said was, look, think about this too, in the context of today's world. He says, have you ever wondered why all the politicians are nice looking? Right? And the point that he's driving at is rhetoric can affect people, not just rhetoric, but looks and everything connected, but it's the substance of that individual that you should listen to rather than just the outwards, how that person looks. So he walked around barefoot around Athens. My voice keeps cracking. He walked around Athens barefoot, purposefully didn't really have a home. He wanted to kind of look a little scruffy in order to make the point. You can have an influence so long as you got content to the kind of a person you are. So he developed this Socratic method, right? This method of sort of asking questions in order to draw out the answer from a student. He was kind of a proponent of really self-reflection. What is the basis of humanness? Think about yourself. Know yourself so that you can live to the fullest, right? And be who you should be. And Plato develops that even further. And then you kind of know you may have heard of the story how eventually he's accused of bringing false gods into Athens. He spoke out against the sophists, who were kind of the teachers of the day, and he thought it was wrong to charge people for knowledge. Eventually, he dies by drinking hemlock. He's sentenced and he drinks the hemlock. Right? So that's Socrates. His student Plato, he kind of develops that thought a little bit, and he's really concerned with sort of rational thinking and showing how you think. How do you know something? What is knowledge? He also spoke out against democracy. Kind of interesting. Democracy is evil. It's the worst form of government, he says. It's so evil because why would you put the decision-making power into the hands of the people? People know nothing. Some truth to that. But you should give the decision-making power to the philosopher kings, he said. And so that was his kind of big thing. He sort of developed this dual nature of reality. What we have, I'll take some water, thanks. What we have here on earth is just a shadow of what's really true. I mean, he doesn't necessarily say heaven, but thanks, man. But he sort of developed this dual nature and the allegory of the cave, and you probably have heard that before. So that's Plato, and then Aristotle, he's sort of a naturalist. He kind of does like botany and explores science, and his big thing is determine what the purpose of an individual is, and how if you live up to your purpose, then you'll truly be happy. Which is, I mean, there's something to that, right? I mean, if you live up to your purpose that God created you, you will be happy. So Aristotle, he doesn't have God in that, but he calls that entelechy. The point of this, why am I all of a sudden talking about philosophy? The point of this is to show how different this world is from the savage world of the East, right? It's like this is so foreign to people. All of a sudden you're talking about like how you know something, and that's what Hellenism is, right? Hellenism sweeps through the Middle East, the world, and it really kind of takes people off guard, but it changes their whole worldview. Excuse me. It changes just the way they look at life. It changes many other things. That's Western influence, right? All of a sudden you're sort of thinking about more than just survival. You're thinking about how you should live life, how you can be happy, what is pleasure, what is the purpose of a person's life, etc. So Western thinking was very foreign to the ancient world. So what is Hellenism? Okay, Hellenism is basically the spread of Greek religion. Now, Greek religion was closer to the Middle Eastern religion than, let's say, Christianity is to Greek religion. Greek religion's polytheistic, so was Middle Eastern religion, Canaanite religion and Babylonian, Persian. So there's some overlap there, but it's the spread of Greek religion. They have different names for gods, and they incorporate some of the Middle Eastern gods as well. But it's the spread of Greek religion, the spread of Greek education, which focused on wisdom, philosophy, reason, science, those things. The spread of Greek language. And this is when Greek now replaces Aramaic as the lingua franca. If you don't know Greek, you're going to learn it because you need to. That's the language you need to communicate in that world of that day. It's also the spread of their view of the body. So there's an emphasis on physical beauty, the emphasis on perfection, honing your muscles. The Greeks develop an interest in sports, in games, right? The Olympian, or the games at Olympus, these Olympic games. Also the spread of theater, entertainment, plays, that kind of thing. And the focus was on the good of the society. Let's do what's best for everybody, rather than just having, one guy at the top deciding what he thinks everybody should do for him. Can you see any parallels between this and our culture today? Right? I mean, it's almost like I'm describing our culture today, and that's because we live in the West, right? We are a direct descendants of Hellenism. And the Romans picked it up as well, but you see such an emphasis on the body, an emphasis on entertainment, an emphasis on doing what's best for society. How do you determine what's right and wrong? What's best for everybody? So we are heavily influenced even today by Hellenism. And so we can trace sort of our culture and our worldview all the way back to Alexander the Great. And one of the ways that a lot of this Hellenism was spread was through the polis, the Greek cities. It's said that Alexander sponsored the building of 70 different Greek cities. Might be slightly exaggerated, but it's a lot of cities if you think about who in this age has built 70 cities. Right? I mean, that's crazy. There's something like 350 official polises or Greek cities throughout the Greek Empire. Now, Greek city typically had a theater, a Parthenon where the gods resided, and they were sort of lined up, like they were really developed in a very systematic way. So you had sort of north-south roads, east-west roads, grid. Everything's very well organized. Here's an example of a theater. I think that one's in Ephesus, actually. Now, there's a lot that is attractive in Hellenism. I mean, the idea of having an organized society is attractive. You can get a lot more done in a Western city than you can in a Middle Eastern city, and I can say that through experience. Right? It's just organized and things are run smoothly. That's nice. Having government representation, taxation without representation, that's in our DNA. No taxation without representation is in our DNA. That's the Greeks, right? They're we want to have a voice in what laws are being made. Or having a strong military for your own protection as a Greek citizen throughout the whole empire. Or a strong economy. The economy really, was strengthened after Alexander sort of developed these Greek cities. So there's a lot that was attractive in Hellenism, and I think that's one of the reasons why it really took root throughout the Greek Empire. Now, when Alexander the Great dies, as I said, he doesn't leave somebody that's clearly in charge. And so his empire, he doesn't have children that take over. His empire is left up to his generals to how to divide it. And, everybody wants to be a king. So it's basically divided up among 4 of his key generals. Two of these are less important for biblical history. This guy here, Cassander, and Lysimachus, I think is how you're supposed to say his name. But these two generals here, Seleucus and Ptolemy, they're the most important because they basically they grab some territory and they establish many kingdoms. They're many Greek kingdoms. Each of them have their descendants. So you have the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And they fought with each other for the next, let's say from 300 to 63, for the next 240 years. And Israel is sort of caught between these two mini empires, mini kingdoms, right? The Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Now, this is mentioned in Daniel chapter 11. Okay, if you look at Daniel 11, verse 4, you can, if you wanted to read that whole chapter, you could. I'll just read one verse here. But Daniel says, as soon as he has arisen, so a mighty king shall arise, verse 3, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. As soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others beside these. So that's a retelling of what was told in Daniel chapter 8, how that horn that was broken off, the four horns come up. These are the four generals. Same thing. His kingdom is divided among the four winds of heaven, and that's Alexander the Great's kingdom. And as I mentioned, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are the ones who are most influential here in the area of Israel. Now, for the first 100 years, the Ptolemies are superior to the Seleucids. Okay, so the Ptolemies, they actually control the land of Israel. Unfortunately, did I give you the years here? It's basically from about 300 to 200 BC. 300 to 199, actually. So the Ptolemies control the land of Israel, reaching up towards where the Seleucids are. Unfortunately, we have little information about what life was like for the Jews living here in Israel. It'd be nice to know, like, well, how many people were there? What were they doing? What were sacrifices like, at the temple there? Little information. We do know that there's lots of wars going on at that time, right? The two Ptolemies and the Seleucids are fighting against each other. I'm not going to work through this, but if you want to read this at some point, in Daniel chapter 11, you have these different wars that are mentioned. Not all of them that I could see are mentioned, but there's 5 sort of Syrian wars alluded to in Daniel chapter 11. And let me just pause for a second. If you're interested for further reading material, I found this book to be really useful. John Lennox, you might have ever heard of him. I really like this guy. He wrote a book on Daniel called Against the Flow. If you're looking for just a little commentary that's like packed with really good stuff, John Whitcomb's book is actually really helpful. It's just really terse, but really, he kind of hits the key points and really good, easy read. So these are 2 commentaries that I like on Daniel. If you're looking for something that goes into a little bit more depth, if you want to come look at it afterwards, you can have a look. So we know there's a lot of wars going on under the Ptolemies. We know of 2 events, though, that happened during this period. One of them is what's known as, the scholars call it the Tobiad romance. It's like a romance novel, it's a story. It's about the Tobiad family. And really, the Tobiads were probably descendants of a guy called Tobias. Remember in Nehemiah's day, one of Nehemiah's antagonists was called Tobiad or Tobias. So they are a sort of a prominent Jewish family living in Israel who become wealthy from Egypt. So they are pro-Ptolemy. Okay, because you imagine the Israelites living in the land of Israel. The Ptolemies are ruling the land. Not everybody's going to be favorable towards those overlords. One Jewish family that's the Tobiads. But incidentally, they're related to the high priestly family that was living at the time. The high priest was a guy called Onias. Okay, so they're the Oneids. And they were against Egypt. So you have sort of this rift that develops between the kind of members of the high priestly household. Some of them are pro-Egypt, some of them are anti-Egypt. And this is talked about in Josephus. Okay, so he talks about this story, kind of goes into some detail. That's about the only history we have of what's going on in this period. And I think really the key takeaway here is that the Jews at the time were divided in their responses to the Ptolemies. Makes sense. Some of them are going to be like, let's just submit to them and life will be better. Some of them are like, no way. Let's fight against them. Let's withhold paying taxes and maybe they'll go away and we can have independence again. Second event that happened during this period is when the Old Testament is first translated. So now we're going to shoot over to Egypt. Remember, the Jews go over to Egypt in about Jeremiah's time. Okay, taking a step back here. So we're like in the 580s, let's say, BC. And this is when the Septuagint is first translated. Remember, the Jews go down there, they start to forget Hebrew. And at this point, we're now in the Hellenistic period. So the Jews are going to be speaking Greek in Egypt because the Greeks are controlling Egypt, right? The Ptolemies are down there in Egypt. And so one of the kings, Ptolemy the Fourth, I think it is, don't quote me on that, I think it's Ptolemy the Fourth, he has an idea. In Alexandria, there's a library, and he wants to have every single book in the world there. So he says, well, we got hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Egypt. Let's have their book in our library, and let's translate it in a language that everybody can speak. Let's translate it into Greek. So he calls in 6 people from every tribe, so that makes 72, right? There's 12 tribes, to come help with this translation. And that's where the word Septuagint comes from. The word means 70, and the Roman numeral LXX, L is 50, X is 10, right? So 50, it's a shortened for 72. There were 72 people that helped in the translation, but that's why the Septuagint is sometimes called the LXX. Sometimes it's just called Septuagint. And this is talked about in a book which is somewhat boring, actually. It's really long, but there's some interesting parts to it. But it's called the Letter of Aristeas. And it talks about how the LXX was translated under Ptolemy Philadelphus of Egypt in these years here. He chooses 6 representatives from each tribe, and magically, after 72 days, incidentally, every single one of these, or all 12 of these individual groups, translate the Bible exactly the same. So there's no differences in any of the words between these 12 different translations. So they say, okay, we're going to compile this into one. This is now the Septuagint. Now, I think there's a little bit of creative license taken there. I'm sure there's some differences, but at least that's the gist of what happened. Okay, so they translate the Bible into Greek, and I mentioned this before. The Pentateuch they started with the Pentateuch. In Jewish thinking, Jewish life, the Pentateuch, that's the first 5 books of Moses. Those were the most important books. So they start translating those. Now, here's an interesting point. Almost every manuscript that we have of the Septuagint today has been copied and preserved in a Christian, not in a Jewish circle. Okay, so almost every ancient manuscript of the Septuagint was copied by Christian copyists rather than Jewish copyists. Now, why is that? Because it was first sponsored by Jews, right? This is 200, I didn't give you the year, but we're about 250 BC, let's say. About 250 years before Christians come along. So from 250 BC till 2021 today, all of the ancient manuscripts were copied by Christians. I think there's several reasons for that. Why did the Jews lose interest in the LXX? One, it's because Christians used it as their version of the Old Testament, right? Christians used it as their version of the Old Testament. The New Testament frequently quotes from the Greek version. And it sort of makes sense. I mean, it's written in Greek, but it's going to use predominantly the Greek translation rather than the Hebrew version. And in addition to that, Christian apologists frequently used the Greek Old Testament in their debates with Jews. So now I'm talking about like the 2nd century AD. Okay, so I gave you one example. There's a guy called Justin, I think that's Justin Martyr. He's speaking with a Jewish opponent to the gospel, okay, 200 years after Jesus. And he quotes from Psalm 96, verse 10. He says, this is what Psalm 96, verse 10 says. Say among the nations that the Lord reigned from the tree. Does that sound like anything? He reigned from the tree. And he says that the Jews cut out the words from the tree so as to remove references to the crucifixion. So he's trying to make the case that Jesus was predicted in the Old Testament. He's like, look, even in Psalm 96, it says the Lord reigned on the tree. The problem is it's not a very good argument because this guy, he's a non-Christian. He says, whether the rulers of the people have erased any portion of the scriptures as you affirm, God knows, but it seems incredible. Trypho's a skeptic. He's like, I don't think so. That doesn't sound right to me. Because Justin's argument is the Jews took out the reference to Jesus. Trypho says, I don't know. And Trypho was right. From a tree was not omitted by the Jews, but was added by the Christians. Maybe that's too complicated. The point is that because Christian apologists used the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Jews eventually lost interest in it. And so it was the Christians who preserved the Septuagint on up until today. And a second reason is that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the standard text of the Hebrew Bible was established. Now, what I mean by that is you had manuscripts, kind of floating around. You might have a manuscript in Jerusalem, you might have a manuscript in Alexandria, you might have a manuscript in Babylon, you might have a manuscript in another city in Israel. Let's standardize all of them and make sure that they're all saying the same thing. Okay, so that was sort of standardized beginning in the sort of 3rd centuries AD. The consonants were fixed around that time in the Old Testament. The vowels were added later on in about the 6th century AD, and all of that came to be known as the Masoretic text. Now, I know all of that probably sounds confusing. What do you mean they added vowels? I'll have to tell you about that sometime later. But Hebrew is a language without vowels, okay? And so they added the vowels in order to just make it easier to read, is what they did. So the point is, at this time, the Hebrew Old Testament is sort of being standardized. And you're like, oh, now, all these manuscripts are kind of compiled. We don't need the Septuagint anymore. We're interested in the Hebrew scriptures. So that's why the Christians, it was preserved predominantly by Christians. Now the question is, does the Septuagint have any value today? And I think it does, more in a scholarly context, though, honestly. Like, when we read our English Bibles, we have the luxury of, there's been scholars working on these English translations. And in order to produce the most accurate translation, these scholars sometimes are looking at what the Greek Bible says and at what the Hebrew Bible says, and they're determining in which hand is the gold coin. Which text is preserving the accurate text, the one that was given by God. And occasionally, the Septuagint preserves the right text. Okay, it might have the right word, it might have the right sentence as it compares to the Hebrew. So it does represent, or it does help in textual criticism. I'm going to skip that. I'll just keep going. Sometimes the Septuagint can preserve a correct reading, and I mentioned this earlier, but in a different way. What I mean by this is sometimes the Hebrew text can be a little bit confusing. Like, what does it actually mean? And the Greek text might have a word or something that clarifies it a little bit and makes it a little bit more clear as what the original intention was. And I think that's the case in Isaiah 7, but I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to confuse you. Sometimes not. Psalm 151, for example, I think the Greek text doesn't doesn't preserve the accurate psalm, because there is no Psalm 151, right? But there is in the Septuagint. So sometimes it preserves inaccurate texts. Or in Jeremiah, for example, the book of Jeremiah is 1/8 shorter in the Greek as compared to in the Hebrew. Okay, so there are some differences, but it does have value for helping. I think the simplest way is just think of it this way. In which hand is the gold coin, right? When we want to know what God said, we have all these texts in front of us. Let's use them to try and get as close as we can to that original autograph, right? To the one that was totally perfect without any mistakes. And that's the one that Isaiah wrote or that Jeremiah wrote. That's the Septuagint. It's translated in about 250 BC in Egypt, okay, under the Ptolemies, under the Ptolemaic influence. And that's where I'm going to stop, because in 199 there's a battle and the Seleucids take over, and then we get into the story of Hanukkah, how the temple was desecrated, and what the Jews did in response. Fascinating story. I'll leave that cliffhanger for you so that you come back next week. See you guys. Have a good night.